Music was born from silence, but not from the reverent silence that fills a concert hall moments before the first chord. It was born from the cold, humiliating silence of the night, a silence torn apart by drunken shouts and a child's tears. In the small German town of Bonn, a boy lived in the attic of a modest house. He was only 4 years old and should have been sleeping, but his father had other plans. His father, Johann van Beethoven, was a tenor in the court chapel. He was also a failure, a mediocre musician, an envious and bitter drunkard, consumed by a single thought, the fame of another German boy, a prodigy from Salzburg named Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart's father, Leopold, had turned his son into a sensation, a source of income and glory. Johann decided that his own son, little Ludwig, would be his answer to the world. He would become the new Mozart. And so he began to forge his genius. Cruelly, clumsily, and relentlessly. In the middle of the night, returning from the tavern, he would burst into the room, drag the sleepy, crying Ludwig from his bed, and pull him to the harpsichord. There, in the cold room, by the light of a candle stub, he forced the tiny fingers to run across the icy keys. For hours. Any mistake, any note played incorrectly, was punished with a shout or a slap. The boy had to stand on a small bench just to reach the instrument. His tears dripped onto the yellowed keys, mingling with the music. This was not education, it was conditioning. The father was not trying to develop his son's talent, but to exploit it. He lied about his son's age, making him 2 years younger, to make his abilities seem even more phenomenal. At 6, he forced him to give his first public concert. A small, frightened boy, who should have been playing with toy soldiers, stood on stage before aristocrats, his only thought being not to make a mistake, lest his father fly into another rage. But something unforeseen happened. In this atmosphere of fear and violence, the boy did not break. He found not torment in music, but refuge. The harpsichord, that instrument of torture, became his only friend, the only world where he could be himself. When his father left him alone, he continued to play. But now, he wasn't playing memorized scales. He was improvising. He poured all his pain, his anger, his desperate loneliness into the sounds. Music became his language, his way of speaking to a world that was so cruel to him. And in these childhood improvisations, the roar of a future titan could already be heard. They lacked Mozart's lightness and grace. Instead, they held power, drama, and an untamed force that both frightened and mesmerized the few who could hear it. He grew into a difficult, sullen, and withdrawn child. He did not play with his peers. He did not trust people. He learned the main lesson of his childhood. Love and approval must be earned. They are not given freely. His father loved him only when he played well. The world applauded him only when he stunned everyone with his virtuosity. This model, love in exchange for genius, would become the tragedy of his entire life. He would desperately seek love, but would not know how to accept it, believing himself worthy only in moments of creative triumph. Johann Beethoven tried to create a second Mozart. He failed spectacularly. Instead of a graceful, worldly court musician, he had, without realizing it, forged something entirely different in his drunken smithy. He had forged a revolutionary, a man who hated any form of tyranny, from his own fathers to that of kings. A man who believed in only one aristocracy, the aristocracy of the spirit. He taught his son not to love music, but to fight with it. His entire future life would become one great battle. a battle with teachers who tried to confine his genius within the bounds of rules, a battle with aristocrats whom he despised but depended on for money, a battle with women whom he idolized but could not keep, and finally, the most terrible battle of all, against the silence that was creeping in to steal the one thing that was truly dear to him: music. His father's tyranny became unbearable, and his alcoholism grew more destructive. Johann Beethoven was losing his voice, his job, his humanity. The family sank into poverty, and soon the burden of supporting them fell on the teenager's shoulders. At 13, Ludwig was forced to leave school to become an assistant organist in the court chapel. Unable to properly multiply or divide, he was already a professional musician and the family's breadwinner. By day, he played the organ during church services and gave music lessons to the spoiled children of aristocrats. By night, he played the viola in the theater orchestra. It was grueling, back-breaking work, but it gave him priceless experience. He learned the inner workings of every instrument and studied the entire operatic and symphonic repertoire from the inside. He was like a sponge, absorbing all the sounds of the world. But Bonn was becoming too small for him. The small provincial town was a cage for his growing genius. All his thoughts and dreams were directed south to Vienna. At the end of the 18th century, Vienna was not just the capital of the Austrian Empire. It was the capital of music. It was the city where Haydn and Salieri worked. It was the city where the god, idol, and eternal rival Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart lived and reigned. To hear Mozart, and if lucky, to take a few lessons from him, this dream became an obsession for Beethoven. His talent did not go unnoticed. A few enlightened aristocrats in Bonn, most notably Count Waldstein, realized they were holding an uncut diamond. They saw in this sullen, awkward youth not just a virtuoso, but something more, the future glory of German music. It was they who raised the money and persuaded the Elector, the ruler of Bonn, to let the 17-year-old Beethoven go to Vienna. In the spring of 1787, he arrived in the city of his dreams. Vienna stunned him. The magnificent palaces, wide streets, theaters, the glitter of aristocratic salons. It was all so different from his native Bonn. And somewhere here, in this shining labyrinth, lived Mozart. Legend has it that their meeting took place. Beethoven was brought to the great maestro's home. Mozart, jaded by the endless stream of child prodigies brought before him, was cool. He had him play some memorized piece. Beethoven played brilliantly, but Mozart remained indifferent. Then Beethoven, wounded to the core, did what he did best. He asked Mozart for a theme to improvise on. With a sly smile, Mozart played a simple but tricky melody. And then a transformation occurred. The sullen, clumsy youth at the instrument vanished. In his place stood a demon, a titan. Beethoven took Mozart's theme and began to play with it. He turned it inside out, tore it apart, and built from it grandiose, unprecedented cathedrals of sound. He showed everything he was capable of: his power, his tenderness, his rage, his bottomless depth. Mozart listened, his expression changing. He grew pale. When Beethoven finished, silence hung in the room. Mozart walked over to his friends in the next room and, pointing to Beethoven, said, "Mark that young man. He will make himself a name in the world." It was the highest praise he could have ever dreamed of. It seemed his future was set. But fate dealt him another blow. Just 2 weeks after his triumph, he received a letter from Bonn. His mother was dying of tuberculosis. He was forced to interrupt his studies and rush back. He found her still alive, but these were her last, agonizing days. His mother was the only person he had ever truly loved, the only safe harbor in his cruel childhood. Her death was a terrible tragedy for him. He was stuck in Bonn for another 5 years. 5 lost years, as it seemed to him. His father descended completely into alcoholism and was dismissed from service in disgrace. At 19, Ludwig officially became the head of the family, taking on the guardianship of his 2 younger brothers. He was crushed by grief, humiliated by poverty, and overwhelmed by responsibility. But he never stopped working. He continued to compose, and in his music from those years, dark, passionate, full of drama, the echoes of his suffering can be heard. It was during these years that a fresh wind of change blew into his life. News of the revolution in neighboring France was spreading. The words liberty, equality, fraternity ignited minds across Europe. For Beethoven, who had hated tyranny and class inequality since childhood, these ideas were a revelation. He enthusiastically read Schiller and Goethe, believing in the dawn of a new era where talent and spirit, not birthright, would rule. This revolutionary passion, this faith in the heroic individual capable of changing the world, would become the core of all his future work. His patrons did not abandon him. Count Waldstein continued to believe in him, and when the great Joseph Haydn passed through Bonn in 1792, returning from a triumphant trip to London, Waldstein arranged a meeting. He showed Haydn one of Beethoven's cantatas. The old master was impressed and agreed to take the young man on as a student if he came to Vienna again. The chance had come. This time, Beethoven was leaving for good. His friends and patrons saw him off. Count Waldstein wrote prophetic words in his farewell album. In November 1792, the 22-year-old Ludwig van Beethoven arrived in Vienna for the second time. Mozart was no longer alive. He had died a year earlier in poverty and obscurity. Beethoven was not just to take his place. He was destined to shatter the musical world that Mozart and Haydn had created and build his own upon its ruins. Vienna greeted him very differently this second time. He was no longer an unknown youth, but a student of Haydn himself, a living classic revered throughout Europe. This opened the doors to the most influential aristocratic salons. The princes Lichnowsky, Lobkowitz, Razumovsky, the wealthiest and most educated men of the empire, patrons for whom music was not just entertainment, but a cult. They collected composers as others collected paintings, and they immediately recognized something extraordinary in this new, wild man from Bonn. Beethoven was the absolute antithesis of Mozart and Haydn. They were court musicians, masters of polite conversation, dressed in the latest fashion. Beethoven, however, was like an untamed beast. He was not handsome, short, stocky, with a pockmarked, swarthy face that earned him the nickname, quote, and a perpetually disheveled mane of black hair. He was rude, impatient, and could easily insult a prince who dared to talk during his performance. He despised etiquette and aristocratic conventions. But when he sat down at the piano, a miracle happened. In his hands, the instrument transformed, at times into a full orchestra, at others, into a human voice, capable of expressing the entire spectrum of emotions, from a barely audible whisper to a furious roar. His improvisations were legendary. This was not elegant background music. These were volcanic eruptions. He would take a simple theme and begin a battle with it, tormenting it, developing it to an unprecedented scale, driving his listeners to tears, to ecstasy, to nervous exhaustion. After he played, ladies would faint, and men, battle-hardened officers, were not ashamed of their tears. Vienna was conquered. This tempestuous genius, this became the most fashionable figure in the city. The aristocrats forgave him everything: his rudeness, his slovenliness, his scandalous character. They vied to invite him to their homes, showered him with money, and commissioned works from him. Prince Lichnowsky gave him lodgings in his palace and treated him not as a servant, but as an equal, a friend. But behind this facade of success lay another life, one full of conflict. His lessons with Haydn quickly disappointed him. Haydn was a genius of harmony and order. Beethoven was a genius of chaos and passion. The old master tried to force his turbulent talent into the strict framework of classical forms. Beethoven resisted. He found Haydn's lessons boring and secretly took lessons from other, less famous teachers, including Mozart's sworn rival, Antonio Salieri. When Haydn found out, he was offended. Their relationship remained cool. Beethoven would later say, "It was untrue, but it revealed his character. He refused to be anyone's student. He wanted only to be himself." He conquered Vienna not only as a piano virtuoso, but also as a composer. His first sonatas, trios, and concertos, published during these years, astounded his contemporaries with their novelty and dramatic power. He took familiar classical forms, but filled them with such a turbulent, personal, almost autobiographical content as music had never known. His slow movements contained a bottomless sorrow, while his fast movements possessed a titanic, crushing energy. This was the music of a man who was not entertaining, but confessing. He worked hard and earned a great deal. For the first time in his life, he was free from humiliating poverty. But he was as lonely as he had been in childhood. He desperately needed love, and he was constantly falling in love. His passions were always young aristocratic women, his students, girls from the very high society he both despised and aspired to. Giulietta Guicciardi, the Brunswick sisters. He dedicated sonatas to them. The famous Moonlight Sonata was dedicated to Giulietta, and wrote them passionate letters. But all these romances were doomed. He, a commoner, a genius with no pedigree, could not marry a countess or a princess. The class divide was insurmountable. Each new love ended in disappointment and pain, which he poured again and again into his music. He was at the pinnacle of success, young, famous, a recognized genius, the idol of Vienna. He had won. He had proven to everyone, and above all, to his tyrant father, long vanished into obscurity, that he was the best. It seemed nothing could stop his triumphant march. And it was at this very moment, at the peak of his fame, that fate, as if jealous, dealt its cruelest, most insidious blow. He began to notice something strange was happening to him. At first, it was a barely perceptible noise in his ears, a quiet, persistent ringing that never ceased. Then he found himself asking people to repeat what they had said more and more often. He started to avoid noisy gatherings because he struggled to distinguish speech amidst the general hum of voices. He, the man whose world was composed of the finest nuances of sound, was going deaf. For any person, this would be a tragedy. For him, it was the end of the world. It was a death sentence handed down by fate itself. It began not like a thunderstorm, but like a quiet, almost imperceptible poison seeping into his blood. In 1796, at the height of his fame and at the age of 26, Beethoven first experienced the ominous symptoms. Initially, it was just tinnitus, a constant, exhausting ringing in his ears. He described it as a continuous buzzing, whistling, and humming that never stopped, day or night. He tried to ignore it, attributing it to overwork or a cold. but the noise persisted. It only grew louder, turning the silence so essential for creation into torture. Then came the second stage. He began to lose the ability to distinguish high frequencies. The gentle sounds of a flute, the singing of birds, a soft laugh. These colors began to fade from his sonic palette, replaced by a muffled, distorted world of low and mid-range tones. He was terrified, but his terror was mixed with a deep, paralyzing shame. How could he, Ludwig van Beethoven, the greatest pianist and composer in Vienna, admit to the world that he, a musician, was losing his hearing? It was unthinkable. It would be like a painter admitting he was going blind, or a chef that he was losing his sense of taste. It was professional suicide. So he decided to hide his illness. He began to avoid people, afraid his affliction would be noticed. Already a recluse, he became a true hermit. Where his rudeness and reserve were once seen as the eccentricities of a genius, they now concealed a desperate fear. He often pretended not to hear questions, blaming his famous absent-mindedness. He declined invitations to the salons where he once shone, feeling lost and humiliated in the cacophony of voices, unable to follow a conversation. In desperation, he consulted doctors. They gave him various diagnoses, from digestive problems to damage to the auditory nerve. He was treated with poultices, oils, baths, and dubious remedies. Nothing helped. The deafness advanced slowly but relentlessly, like a glacier. He lived a double life. In public, he was the same self-assured, formidable virtuoso. Alone, he plunged into an abyss of despair. His letters from this period are a cry from the soul. "I must confess that I lead a miserable life," he wrote to a friend. "For almost 2 years, I have ceased to attend any social functions simply because I find it impossible to say to people, 'Speak louder, shout, for I am deaf.' How could I possibly admit an infirmity in the one sense which ought to be more perfect in me than in others? For me, there can be no pleasure in human society. I must live like an exile." The climax of this internal hell came in the summer of 1802. On his doctor's advice, he left bustling Vienna for the quiet suburb of Heiligenstadt, hoping that peace and country air would help him. But the silence of the countryside only amplified his suffering. He could no longer deceive himself. He realized his illness was incurable. He found himself on the verge of a complete nervous breakdown and suicide. At this moment, standing on the edge of the abyss, he wrote one of the most stunning human documents in history, a letter to his brothers that was never sent and became known as the quote. It was not a will in the legal sense. It was a confession, a cry of the soul, a farewell to the world. He wrote, "In this text, soaked in pain, his rebirth occurred. He had walked to the very edge, looked death in the eye, and made a decision. He would not kill himself. He would live. He would live for his art. If fate wanted to fight him, he would accept the challenge. He would defy it." His testament resonates not only with despair, but with a titanic, almost insane stubbornness. He wrote in another letter, "He returned to Vienna a different man. Outwardly, he became even more sullen and withdrawn. But within him, a revolution had taken place. The period that musicologists call his period was over. A new period had begun. He would no longer write elegant, worldly music. He would write music of struggle, suffering, and transcendence. His deafness, which should have been his curse, became his secret weapon. Shielded from the outside world, from its hustle and its fashionable musical trends, he delved into the depths of his own inner world. He no longer heard music as others did. He heard it within himself. And the music he heard there was unlike anything created before. The very first work born from this fire was his Third Symphony. It was dedicated to a man Beethoven idolized at the time, Napoleon Bonaparte. To him, Napoleon was not just a general, but a living embodiment of the French Revolution's ideals, a heroic titan who would overthrow monarchs and bring freedom to the people. Beethoven poured all his faith in the heroic individual into this symphony. The music was revolutionary. It was twice as long as any symphony written before it. It was filled with unprecedented dissonances, abrupt mood swings, and monstrous tension. The second movement, a funeral march, was particularly staggering, a grandiose fresco of grief for a fallen hero. When the symphony was finished, Beethoven proudly wrote on the title page, Sinfonia Bonaparte. But soon, news arrived that shattered his faith. Napoleon had proclaimed himself emperor. The hero of the revolution, the fighter against tyranny, had become a tyrant himself. Beethoven's student, Ferdinand Ries, who brought in the news, recalled that Beethoven flew into an indescribable rage. He shouted. He went to the table, seized the title page, tore it in two, and threw it on the floor. He later gave the symphony a new title, The Memory of a Hero Who Had Died in His Soul. Thus began his great journey. A deaf composer, disillusioned with earthly heroes, decided to become a hero himself. And his weapon in this battle against fate, silence, and all the world's imperfections would be his music. The decade following the Heiligenstadt crisis was like a volcanic eruption. Freed from the need to please the public and shielded by the advancing wall of deafness, Beethoven composed with a furious, almost supernatural energy. He no longer just wrote music, he waged war with it. Each new work was a battlefield where titanic forces clashed. Darkness and light, chaos and order, despair and hope. And in the finale of this battle, hope always, invariably, emerged victorious. This was his creed, his answer to a merciless fate. While his personal life sank into darkness, he gave humanity music filled with dazzling light. During these years, works that would forever change the landscape of music history flowed from his pen. He wrote his only opera, Fidelio. It was not an opera about love or mythology. It was a political manifesto, a hymn to freedom. Its plot tells the story of a brave woman who, disguised as a man, infiltrates a prison to save her husband, an unjustly condemned political prisoner. Beethoven worked on this opera for 10 years, rewriting it again and again. He poured into it all his hatred of tyranny and all his faith in human loyalty and courage. The final chorus, where the prisoners emerge into the light and sing of freedom, remains one of the most powerful symbols of the fight against oppression. He redefined the sonata. His Appassionata was not an elegant salon piece, but a true sonic tempest, a hurricane of passion that seemed ready to tear the piano apart. His piano concertos, especially the fourth and fifth, Emperor, transformed the soloist from an elegant virtuoso into a heroic figure engaged in a dialogue, a debate, and at times a battle with the entire orchestra. But his main battlefield was the symphony. In 1808, he presented the world with two masterpieces at once, two poles of his genius, the Fifth and Sixth Pastoral Symphonies. The sixth was his declaration of love for nature, the only source of solace in his tormented life. It was a musical painting filled with the babbling of brooks, the songs of birds, and the rumble of a summer storm. But the Fifth Symphony became his most famous, most personal statement. It begins with 4 legendary, menacing notes, about which Beethoven himself, according to his secretary Schindler, said, "Thus fate knocks at the door." The entire first movement is a furious, relentless struggle against this theme of destiny. But the symphony does not end in tragedy. After passing through darkness and doubt, it explodes in the finale into a dazzling, triumphant C major march. It was a musical self-portrait. It was his own story told without words. From darkness to light, through struggle to victory. Those 4 notes became a symbol not only of his music, but of all classical music. He was at the peak of his creative power, but his personal life remained full of suffering. His deafness progressed. He could now hear almost nothing. To communicate, he began using conversation notebooks, in which his interlocutors would write their questions and he would answer orally. These notebooks, which survive to this day, are a tragic monument to his isolation. His chaotic lifestyle became legendary. He constantly moved from one apartment to another, living in monstrous disarray amidst piles of sheet music, leftover food, and unwashed dishes. He never learned to live in the world of men, and he still desperately sought love. His greatest, and perhaps only true love, was a woman whose name remains a mystery. After his death, a letter was found in a secret drawer of his desk. It was undated and had no address. It began with the words, "My angel, my all, my very self." It was a passionate, tender, and desperate confession addressed to the Immortal Beloved. "Can I live otherwise than wholly with you?" he wrote. "Why this deep sorrow when necessity speaks? Can our love endure except through sacrifices, through not demanding everything from one another? Can you change the fact that you are not wholly mine, I not wholly yours?" The identity of this woman, whether she was Antonina Brentano or Josephine Brunswick, remains a subject of debate. But whoever she was, their union was impossible. The letter, full of love and pain, was never sent. He was alone again. His fame thundered across Europe. He was a living legend. But his financial situation remained precarious. He was not a servant, but he depended on the generosity of his aristocratic patrons. To ensure him a decent living, 3 of them, Archduke Rudolf, Prince Kinsky, and Prince Lobkowitz, agreed to pay him a lifelong annuity on the condition that he not leave Vienna. Beethoven finally achieved financial independence, but here too, fate mocked him. The Napoleonic Wars led to the devaluation of the Austrian currency, and his annuity lost its value. One of his patrons died, another went bankrupt. He was once again forced to struggle for his existence. By 1815, he was completely deaf. He could no longer perform as a pianist. His last public performance took place in 1814 and was, according to witnesses, a tragic spectacle. He was playing his own concerto, but could not hear the orchestra. In quiet passages, he played the chords so gently they were inaudible, and in loud ones, he hammered the keys so fiercely that the strings rattled. He left the stage for good. The composer, idolized by all of Europe, was locked in complete, absolute silence. It seemed to be the end. His creative wellspring should have run dry. Many thought he would never write anything significant again. They were wrong. His greatest, most transcendent creations were yet to come. Freed from the shackles of real sound, he was about to write music that no one before him, not even he himself, had ever heard. The music of the future. The silence that should have been his prison became a gateway to another universe. After 1815, Beethoven virtually ceased to appear in public. He retreated into himself, into his inner world, which was now the only place he could hear. And the music he began to hear there, in absolute acoustic isolation, was strange, complex, and at times frightening. It was unlike anything he had written before, and certainly unlike anything written by his contemporaries. He stopped writing for the public, for aristocratic salons, for his own time. He began a dialogue with God, with eternity, with himself. His final, most mysterious and greatest creative period had begun. The world around him was changing. The era of the Napoleonic Wars, an age of heroic hopes and revolutionary storms, gave way to the Restoration period. Titans were replaced by common citizens. Vienna embraced the Biedermeier style, cozy, sentimental, and devoid of any heroic pathos. The public wanted light, entertaining music, the waltzes of Strauss, the virtuosic passages of Italian opera. Beethoven's deep philosophical music seemed too complex, too loud. He began to be seen as a genius who had written himself out, who had lost his mind. He became a living monument to a bygone era, and this gave him ultimate freedom. If the world did not want to listen to him, he would write for those who came after. His appearance in these years became even more startling. He finally transformed into the mythical, disheveled, and mad genius we imagine him to be. He wandered the streets of Vienna, dressed in rags, gesticulating and muttering to himself. In reality, he was Ad, and singing aloud the themes of his future works. Children on the street would point at him and shout, and the police arrested him several times, mistaking him for a vagrant. His domestic life was appalling. He lived in a state of permanent chaos, in filth, amidst mountains of sheet music and leftover food. Servants fled after a few weeks, unable to endure his tyrannical character and unbearable living conditions. A new, exhausting battle was added to his suffering: the fight for his nephew, Karl. After his brother's death, Beethoven, convinced of his sister-in-law's immorality, entered into a long, humiliating legal battle for custody of the boy. He won the battle, but it cost him a great deal of money, stress, and time. He wanted to make Karl a great musician, a copy of himself, his continuation. But his love was despotic and suffocating. He tormented the boy with his overbearing care, his suspicions, his exorbitant demands. Unable to withstand the pressure, Karl eventually attempted suicide by shooting himself in the head. The bullet only grazed his temple, but for Beethoven, it was a terrible blow. He had never been able to build a family. He had never been able to be a good father, perhaps because he never had one himself. And in this hell, in complete deafness, domestic chaos, loneliness, and family tragedy, he created his most luminous, most enlightened music. He moved away from the heroic pathos of his middle years and turned to deeper spiritual matters. He rediscovered the polyphony of Bach, the fugue, counterpoint, the most complex forms of musical thought. His last 5 piano sonatas and last string quartets are music that seems not to have been written by a human hand. They are filled with philosophical contemplation, sudden epiphanies, quiet sorrow, and a transcendent, almost mystical peace. Performers and listeners of the time simply did not understand it. They considered it the ramblings of a deaf madman. Only decades, even a century later, could musicians and critics begin to approach an understanding of these sonic universes. The crown of his life, his ultimate testament to humanity, was the Ninth Symphony. He worked on it for nearly 10 years. For the first time in history, he decided to introduce a choir and vocal soloists into a symphony. For the finale's text, he chose the Ode to Joy by his beloved poet Friedrich Schiller, a hymn to universal brotherhood that he had dreamed of setting to music since his youth. The idea was grandiose and almost insane. How could a deaf composer write such a monumental work, especially for a choir whose sound he could only imagine? The premiere took place on May 7, 1824, in Vienna. The hall was packed. The entire city came to see the living legend who had not appeared in public for 12 years. Beethoven stood on stage next to the conductor to set the tempos, but he was completely absorbed in his inner music, turning the pages of the score, not hearing a single note of what was happening in the hall. The symphony stunned the audience. It began with a dark, almost chaotic rumble, passed through storm and despair, and erupted in the finale into an all-conquering hymn of joy. It was his last and greatest story of humanity's journey from darkness to light. When the music ended, the hall erupted in ovation. People stood, applauded, shouted, and threw hats and handkerchiefs into the air. But Beethoven, his back to the audience, heard none of it. He continued to turn the pages of the score, lost in his silence. Then one of the soloists, the young Carolyn Unger, approached him, took him by the hand, and gently turned him to face the audience. Only then did he see. He saw the sea of ecstatic faces, the tears in people's eyes, the hundreds of hands waving at him. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated tragedy and triumph. The man who could not hear the applause saw it, and this image, the deaf composer being turned by a singer to face a sea of human love, has become perhaps the most poignant symbol of his life. He had won. He had delivered his message to the world. This was his last great triumph. After the Ninth Symphony, he delved into work on his late string quartets, music that was his final word, his ultimate testament. His health was rapidly deteriorating. To his old ailments were added dropsy and severe liver disease, exacerbated by years of consuming cheap wine. He knew the end was near. In his final months, he read a great deal, especially the works of ancient philosophers, and often repeated, "Applaud, my friends, the comedy is over." He died on March 26, 1827, during a fierce thunderstorm. Legend has it that in his final moment, as lightning flashed and thunder crashed outside, he raised his fist to the heavens, as if in a last act of defiance, a final challenge to fate. A crowd of 20,000 gathered for his funeral. Almost all of Vienna came to bid farewell to its sullen, tempestuous genius. The Austrian poet Franz Grillparzer, who wrote the words for his eulogy, perfectly captured his essence. He was an artist, but he was also a man. He withdrew from the world because he could find no weapon to oppose it, but he bequeathed everything to you. He left behind more than just music. He left behind proof. Proof that the human spirit can transform the most terrible suffering into the greatest beauty. He did not simply fight against fate. He seized it by the throat, forced it into silence, and dictated his own melody to it. A melody of struggle, suffering, and all-conquering joy.